We can.
Ready? Okay. So greetings everyone. Lecture 6 on the course on the theories of, or the rise and fall of complex societies. Today we'll continue talking about the structure of empires, and as we begin to move into the theories of collapse. Again, my name is Jay Silverstein, professor here at the School for Advanced Studies, and welcome to the people who might be streaming from the outside, and of course welcome to the class here in Russia. So, if I can get this. No. All right. Okay, do we have the right slide up there, lecture 6? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm never quite sure what you're seeing as compared to what I'm seeing. All right, so just a little bit of bookkeeping to start off with. Again, for my students who are able, please turn on your videos unless there's some sort of technical issue. And so we have a couple of upcoming talks on collapse of from different areas of the world. So on May 21st, we're extremely lucky to have Eric Klein talking with us. And so he's going to be talking about the late Bronze Age, which he is probably the world's foremost authority on at this point, the collapse of that. I'll be assigning his lecture on YouTube, which has about 4 million views so far. So with you guys, it'll be like 4,020,000. And I'll put up some of his readings. He wants to structure it more as a panel discussion. So I'm going to give you the readings before the 21st and expect you to submit questions based on the readings. And those questions, then you'll be able to engage with him about and ask him. And again, you know, the period that we're talking about, the late Bronze Age in 1177, this is the time of the biblical stories of the beginnings of Judaism with the Exodus. This is the Trojan War. So, I mean, these are events that have become embedded in the mythology and the history of Western civilization. So having a chance to talk to one of the foremost archaeologists who's been working on this since I first met him at a conference in 1990, I think it was. So he's really phenomenal. He's got a real knack for taking the history and putting it into a context related to modern times as well. And then we'll have our very own Denis Sharapov talking about his work with complex societies in the southern Ural Mountains. Then on May 28th, we'll have Fred Hebert, who is the head archaeologist for the National Geographic magazine, talking about his dissertation work in the Eurasian steppes, again with complex societies and related to the fall of the Harapan and Indus Valley civilization. And then Guillermo de Anda Alanis, I know his work, I haven't met him before, but he's also agreed to give a talk. And he's been doing some fantastic underwater work in caves in the Yucatan Peninsula, looking at some of the phenomena associated with the importance of water in the rise, maintenance, and eventual collapse of Maya civilization in the Yucatan. And so you can see in that one picture of him diving in the cave, there's the skull of you can tell that's a Maya elite person because of the skull deformation, whereas a young child, the child had their head bound to shape the skull, and that was something that was only done with the nobility the Maya. So the stuff he's been finding in these caverns tell us a lot about the rituals and the importance of water in Maya civilization. So, whoops, I think I put that in the wrong place there, but let's. I lost the slide. Okay. Someone in their note that you submitted had asked a question about this nature of multi-layered social power, the networks that we are involved in, that Michael Mann talks about in his book. So I just wanted to talk about it just a little bit, and I thought that maybe the Matryoshka dolls might serve a little bit as an example. I recognize, doing a little research, that they have mostly to do with the role of women and mothers and babushka, and the importance of women within Russian society traditionally. But there's something about the character of them being nested one inside the other that I think also serves as a metaphor for trying to understand who we are as people, that we also have all sorts of layers of personality, all sorts of layers of society, of family, of culture that make us who we are and that help us make decisions and direct how we act. And so I thought, just looking at these dolls and thinking of them as a metaphor of an individual layered on with all sorts of different aspects of social interaction that guide us in our behavior and our assumption of identity and participation and membership into societies, various societies. So the statement was based on societies are constituted of multiple overlapping and intersecting socio-spatial networks of power. And so again, the Venn diagram, I think, best illustrates it. If we're in the center of this, that we have all these different spheres that we interact with that guide us in our making decisions every day. And those are social power. You're being pulled and pushed to act in a certain way. And every one of us, whether we realize it or not, are acting as part of this larger piece of history of human social and political organization. You vote, you pay taxes, you participate in the economy, you transmit knowledge, you do all the functions associated with the maintenance of the society. If you feel upset with it, at some point you may be working to dismantle the society and try to restructure it as something better. And you may do that in overt ways, illegal ways, or you may do it within the rules of the society and try to, through education, writing, expression of opinion, social media, different ways, that you are part of this dynamic, and recognizing that, that there are millions of people involved, or hundreds of millions, you are still one part of that. And so when we talk about these theories about the rise and collapse of society, I think one of the things I really want to get across to you is that they're not something that happened to a people, 2,000 years ago, in that the behaviors are fundamentally the same behaviors that you're involved in, because these are social behaviors. So the technology change, the context, the circumstances, those can all shift around, but the aspects of what you decide to do with your life within the context of your society, those forces are not dissimilar to what people would have felt in ancient times as well. When you look at migrants moving from Guatemala, trying to make it all the way across Mexico to pass into the American border and get into the United States, what are those forces that are driving those migrants to move that way? And then what are those forces in America that are prompting some people to want to build a wall or to jail them or to take their children away or to scare them. Those are all these same type of forces when we think about the collapse of societies or the formation of societies in ancient times. These are the same types of emotions and experiences that people are having. Context is different, time is different, technology is different, but the human interaction aspect, the social, the powers that affect us, the desperation that might drive people to do things, those are all consistent. We are still humans, and we're still working within these networks of social power. So, and that's what's nice about Michael Mann's model, is that he's looking at these spheres of social power, recognizing that some of the contextual things will change, but we're still subject to those four basic categories that he uses, such as ideology, politics, military, and economics. But you can think about it in different ways as well. And so here I just put a handful, but if you think the forces of the government, the church, your work, your school, your social groups that you interact with in your family, that these are all social forces acting on you, and you're in the middle. And when you choose to do something, it's because you're negotiating all these different forces that affect you. And the same thing is true when we think of societies. I think something we're going to emphasize as we get towards the collapse is that we can understand the process of collapse a lot from our own personal experiences and the things that we can observe now, particularly now, but recognize that what affects us at a local level, you have to imagine it being networked into a larger society. So the types of stresses that you might feel, they're not dissimilar to what the society is feeling as a whole. For example, with the quarantine now, or if you're having economic issues, whatever your issues may be, these forces are similar to what would have affected people in the past. And when we're looking at the collapse of entire society, then you want to just kind of amplify those and understand what it might mean in this larger, more complex network of human interactions. Questions? So I want to play a little game. So what's an RPG? Does anyone know? Andre, I see you smiling, What's an RPG?
Role-playing game.
Okay, so like what? Can you give me the name of a role-playing game?
D&D.
Okay, Dungeons and Dragons. Everyone's heard of that, I take it?
Yes.
So we're going to play a role-playing game. And so now you can see my background. It looks like we're stuck in the dungeon here, right? So we're going to imagine that we're all in a dungeon, and I'll be the dungeon master. And so here we are, all stuck inside. We got no obvious way out. And we are stuck there for indefinitely. And one of us, and I'll play a non-player character, I think it is. I have a candy bar, and nobody else has any food. So, I see a question here. Okay. So, Leonid, you're hungry. You're stuck in the dungeon with 20 of us. There's one candy bar. What are you going to do?
It's a hard question.
I have it.
Yeah.
First of all, we can fight.
Okay, Daria wants to fight. Do you think you're tough enough to take me on?
I don't think that.
You want to try and roll for that critical hit?
So we can try to share this one chocolate bar with all of us.
Okay, so Daria has a skill in Marxist philosophy and believes that we can therefore share it.
Yeah.
So so you try to convince me of that, and it doesn't work. I say, no, I'm not going to share it.
So I would like to talk with you and convince you that this candy bar will be divided only by those people who can be useful at getting us from this place.
Oh, no, I'm going to say keep it.
Can we buy it?
Oh, no, because what good is money in a dungeon?
Yeah, we will just leave somebody for you, and that's it.
What's that?
I'm saying that if we have no money, we will just leave somebody of us with you, and that's the price.
I agree with Ася. I think one of us should eat the whole chocolate and get a lot of energy and try to save all of us by this energy.
Oh, okay, that's an interesting approach. Does everyone agree with that approach?
You said that there is no way out.
Well, no obvious way out.
So I prefer to die as faster as I can.
Oh, okay. That's an approach that the rest of us probably appreciate.
Maybe we can some kind of serve you, in a case, do something for you, and in exchange get this chocolate, and then decide what to do.
Oh, so we'll establish kind of a socio-political hierarchy where I'm at the top.
Yeah.
Oh, I kind of like the sound of that. Okay. What other options are there? Ilya? Are you able to communicate?
Yeah, I think so. Well, if we're still talking about the chocolates, like I'm actually eating my own chocolates, so I don't see any problems. Guys, you can talk about your own problems. I'm just okay. Sorry.
All right. Good, Asya.
So maybe the option is to unite and to fight with you, but I don't want to get a bad mark, so I will pretend that I said nothing.
If you eliminate me, you don't have to worry about the bad mark, though, do you? A nicer substitute professor. Okay, so uniting, organizing yourselves as a war band and overpowering me by your numbers, right? Is that what you're saying? Kind of like what Canero talks about in his article, when you're circumscribed, you're stuck inside a dungeon or a piece of land, and there's limited resources. You can share it. I can use it to leverage my position because I have the resources to get some status, or you might organize into a war band, which means that it sounds like Asya here is going to be the leader and lead the rebellion against me to overthrow me. Or we could share it and cooperate, and maybe if we work together, we could share it, and then rather than just giving one person all of the energy, work together to figure out a way to break out of the dungeon as a team. Again, organizing ourselves, maybe we have the different skills to be able to do it. So if you think of this sort of microcosm of a scenario where you're stuck in a dungeon and you have to make a decision, and you're going to have to decide something because the situation is not sustainable at this point. There's too many of us, there's too little food, and we're stuck and we're circumscribed within this environment. So we have a handful of choices we can make. We can fight, minimize the strain on the chocolate bar, right? Eliminate some of us. Some of us are willing to sacrifice themselves. Or we can share and begin to cooperate and develop something like, at least a cooperative relationship, if not a hierarchical one. Or you can start to organize into factions, into war bands with leaders, and compete for that chocolate bar. And these decisions aren't dissimilar to this kind of longer and larger scale process when we talk about socio-political centralization, the centralization of authority, that we're stuck as a group and we're stuck in these social interactions and we have to resolve a problem. And there's a handful of different ways we can do it. Some of them could lead to our complete annihilation, but some of them could lead to us being organized and to carry on with a new appreciation and a new organization that allows us to continue to be successful in other types of endeavors. If we're all stuck in there and we're all working to get out and we get out, how do you feel when you get out? Has anyone ever been in a tough situation with a group of people and then you get out and you survive? I'll tell you, I've had lots of experiences like that. And I remember walking out of North Korea, for instance, with a group of guys, a group of soldiers I was there with. And, when you get out, man, you're kind of hugging each other and there's a sense of solidarity that hey, we just accomplished something pretty cool. We stuck it out and we did a good job. And, it's like winning a team sport. You build solidarity that way and you start to build a group identity. So in the case of, working with a band of soldiers, we get out and we stay friends for a while and then we just kind of become acquaintances and dissipate to our futures. But if you're all stuck within an area and you're living with each other, you guys have social organizations and feelings of, I imagine when this class is over, you all walk out there and be hugging each other if you were allowed to social distance wise, hugging each other and like, oh, we survived, Dr. Silverstein's class. That was pretty cool, right? There's a sense of solidarity that you all went through it. When you get your paper done, your final paper submitted and you do defending your hypothesis on why a civilization collapsed. When you're done, I expect there'll be some sense of solidarity. So there's these types of emotions that we feel on a small scale they resonate within larger scale societies. And so you can understand when we talk about these forces, understanding a little bit of what your own personal experience of interacting with these same sorts of forces are. We do it unconsciously and as part of our life, but if we want to model your personal life, and sociology, of course, does this sort of thing, the same way that we talk about modeling complex societies. So understanding why we're together as a group, as a society, and then as a society, as a family. So, enough role playing? You guys overpower me, ate the candy bar. Okay, so let's go back and we'll talk about Rome again. And last year, it suddenly dawned on me as I was up on Hadrian's Wall in the bottom part of this picture, that the week before I had been in southern Egypt, down in Aswan, at the last cataract of the Nile River as you go south. And I realized that in 1 week I had traversed the northern and southern boundaries of the Roman Empire. And to think, there I was, far off in southern Egypt and then up in, northern England, cold, and you get an idea of the scope of the Roman Empire and how they had built this political institution, this state that spanned all the way from northern Africa to northern England. It was a phenomenal accomplishment. The epitome, it is the hallmark of what we think of when we say empire, and of course it's where the word empire even comes from the assumption of the authority of the emperor. The first, when Julius Caesar first made that transition from being a republic to him being the principal person. The Roman Empire at its height, so all the way up here, you get up to Hadrian's Wall, and then down here, down to Aswan, and down right at the border with Nubia. Just looking at the range and scope of the Roman Empire at the time, something that completely shaped the entire course of Western history, right? Where the names, the language, the fact that we have so much Latin in our language, the names of our kings, whether it's Kaiser or Tsar, rooted in the Caesar's initial assumption of authority. So if we think of the genesis of Rome, again, thinking of those ideas that led to the rise of power, that Rome was situated in kind of a nice position right here in the middle of Italy, because it had the Etruscans, Tuscany, to the north, and then Greek colonies down in Sicily and in southern Italy. So there was a lot of opportunity for cultural exchange and economic exchange. It became kind of a refuge where a lot of ne'er-do-wells ended up, people who were weren't welcome in one or the other areas of the world, ended up living in Rome. And so it began to accumulate people. It took advantage of that position it had. It had decent agricultural land, and was situated in a good central place as far as its international interactions between the Etruscans and the Greek colonists in Italy. So with the rape of Lucretia, does anyone remember this story? So the Etruscan lord ends up raping one of the Roman wives while they're on a military campaign with the Etruscans, because they were subject to the Etruscans. So Lucretia ends up committing suicide after being raped because she's dishonored, and that the Roman men, the Roman men say that they would never again be subject to a tyrant, and they overthrow the Etruscans, and they launch in 509 BC the Roman state that sends us on this trajectory to building this empire. So the mythic origin has to do with, there's various aspects of it, but a big part of it has to do with this abuse of authority by the tyrant who was ruling over them, and particularly the son of the tyrant, who just assumed he could do whatever he wanted. So, and then they also have a mythic origin tied to the Trojans, survivors. Aeneas is surviving the Trojan War, escaping from Troy and coming to Italy. The Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves and brought up, as Romulus becomes the founder of Rome. And so they have this very complex mythology, but it's a very unifying mythology in that it has a strong sense of justice and identity for the Romans. So if we start to look at the political organization that evolves during the Republican period of Rome, they establish a representative body for the male population, the free male population, the Senate, that they, through the magistrates and the assemblies, the Senate appoints consuls. So there's 2 consuls. The consuls each serve for a year. The point of doing, why do they have 2 consuls, first of all? Why, if you're establishing a political system, why would you want 2 executive officers?
So there will be less chances for tyranny, maybe? Yeah,
it's a check and balance, right? So they're appointed by the elected body, And there's two of them, and they limit the term of service, and they put rules on them, and it minimizes the possibility of one person assuming too much control, right? So they're trying to make sure that they don't get subject to a tyrant. So they create a system that has some balances in it to prevent abuse of authority. They do have a system where they can appoint a dictator for a period of up to 1 year, so that they have a chief executive officer to deal with emergency situations. But again, that's a temporary office only for emergencies, and that person then has to step down after 1 year. So this republic they're not trying to be an empire at this point. They don't have an ideology that they're going to be a great empire, but they start getting into conflicts with their neighbors. And one by one, they have to end up fighting wars, and they're victorious. And so they end up incorporating these other city-states into their territory as part of Rome. So as they begin to expand throughout the Italian peninsula, then they start to run into conflict with Carthage, particularly over Sicily. So Carthage, of course, is that Phoenician colony that they call Tunis, or now Tunis. They end up in a series of wars that last about 100 years, ending right around the very end of the 3rd century BC. During the course of the wars, Rome is brought to its knees several times. Hannibal's outside the gates of Rome after having marched all the way from Spain with elephants over the mountains into Rome and defeating Rome in several major battles. Rome on the verge of surrendering, but Hannibal, a little bit too timid, having lost a lot of soldiers as well, doesn't follow through. Had he marched on Rome, after the Battle of Cannae up here in 216, probably Rome would have surrendered. They were so afraid of Hannibal because he had killed, I think, at Cannae, something like 20,000 Roman soldiers. But in the end, Rome wins the Punic Wars, and the Roman Empire expands greatly. So, from Italy, with the conquest of Carthage, they get North Africa, they get Spain, they get Southern Gaul, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, all get brought into what is now truly an empire. Rome continues to expand. They go into Illyria, into Macedonia. In 146, they defeat the Macedonians. Fresh off that victory, here's Macedonia, right? The kingdom of Alexander the Great. The Romans have now conquered it. That other places begin to surrender to them without much of a fight. Egypt at this point become largely a client to them. In fact, right after the victory in Macedonia, the Syrians had invaded Egypt and had marched on Alexandria and were besieging Alexandria. And one Roman goes to help the Egyptians, and he comes before the Syrian king, Antiochus, and tells Antiochus to take his army and go home. And Antiochus looks at this Roman and says, "Who are you to tell me to take my army and go home? I'm on the verge of conquering Egypt and defeating the Ptolemaic Empire." And he says, "I'm the representative of Rome, and you'll take your army and you'll go home." King Antiochus says, "Let me think about it." And the Roman senator takes his staff and he draws a circle in the sand around the king Antiochus. And he says, "Take all the time you want to think about it, but if you step out of that circle, you're at war with Rome." So he puts a situation where Antiochus has to make the decision while he's standing there. If he steps out, then he's chancing war with Rome. And at this point, Rome's military victories have become so legendary that Antiochus takes his army and goes home. He decides he does not want to get stuck in a conflict with Rome, and he pulls back to Syria. Thus, the Romans establish a relationship with Egypt that lasts, of course, throughout the next 100 years until the reign of Cleopatra, who becomes, of course, romantically involved with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. So you can see that Rome has grown during this Republican period into this mentality of being an empire. It's become part of their identity as a state, that they have the ability and the authority to extend their rule as far as they're able to, as far as they're able to develop a logistical and military system that's going to support the expansion of that empire. Questions, comments? So, as we get into the latter part of the 1st century BC, one consul stands out as quite exceptional, and that's Julius Caesar. So he goes into, he's in a bit of financial trouble. He's borrowed a lot of money, so he's got a lot of economic pressure. He's been given control of the armies in northern Italy and in southern Gaul. So he goes in onto military campaign. At this point, there was a big migration of one of the Gallic tribes, the Helvetii, and he goes, supposedly they had hundreds of thousands of people who were invading into Germany. He goes and defeats them in a series of battles and ends up conquering much of Gaul. He comes back to Italy with his legions, and he's got about 26,000 legionnaires with him. I think four legions, or maybe more. And so as he comes back to Italy, one of the rules that the Senate had established to limit the control of the consuls was that they could not bring the army that served them on campaign into Italy. So they were not allowed to cross the Rubicon River with their army. So what does Julius Caesar do, of course? Somebody.
Yeah, he crosses the Rubicon, right?
He crosses the Rubicon, right? And that's a saying that we use nowadays. Do you have it in Russian as well? It's in English. It's very common, right? That's to enter into something that there's no turning back on. You've crossed that line and there's no turning back. Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his armies and marched to Rome, thereby assuming authority and no longer having to give up his position as consul, right? And then they end up dividing rule between 3 leaders who eventually go into a civil war. But from this point on, the constitutional aspects of the Republic begin to fade away as power is shifted from the Assembly, from the Senate, to the imperator, the primary leader, or the triumvirate, the 3 leaders. So just getting, again, a look at the scale of the provincial control of the Roman Empire at this point. Again, this is looking at the Roman Empire at its height in the 2nd century AD. But you can see to what extent they had expanded and controlled, and how they began to politically divide up the empire. And that's really important to understand also, is these provinces, while they were made up of a series of cities, there was also a provincial administration that was important for maintaining communication networks, the infrastructure, roadways, mining, things like that, to bring resources into Rome. So when you build an empire, one of the foremost problems that you have to deal with are the people you conquer. So what are your options? when you conquer somebody as part of an empire? What are your options in dealing with them?
You have to maybe create the same identity. I mean, for all people, for instance, by the means of religion or ideology or so on. But there is another option also, just to frighten them and have a strong power.
Okay, so in terms of Michael Mann, what are you saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that Michael Mann distinguishes a few types of social power, and so here I'm more focusing on ideology, and in the second part of my answer, I am focusing on politics.
Okay, or military?
Yeah, right, military.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So coercion, right? It's forceful coercion by exerting that threat of power, or ideology. Did Rome use ideology?
Maybe not only ideology, but rather culture, because we know that, for instance, in Egypt, it was like, I don't know, it was forced to use. They changed the gods and so on.
Okay, let me, here, Alyssa, I saw you were nodding your head. You think the Romans used ideology?
Like first they like used homogenization, so like they like forced kind of like culture on them, and through Constantine they kind of like did like Christianity as their like religion, which everyone had to believe in. So there was like a change after Constantine.
Yeah, there was a change after Constantine, that's right. Before Constantine, though, ideology was limited in a lot of ways. There did evolve, beginning with Augustus, a cult of the emperor, where you had to worship the emperor as a god. But in general, Rome had a very polytheistic and kind of open door to religion and ideology. First of all, well, we'll talk about it. So if you think of what are some of the religions that manifest in pre-Christian Rome and pagan Rome? Right, they adopted the Greek gods, right? Particularly after conquering Greece and Macedonia, right? They would send people, businessmen would go to Greece to buy statues and of the gods and things like that to bring them back for their villas in Italy. And they just changed the names, Zeus and Jupiter. That they adopted Greek gods. How about other gods? How about the Egyptian gods?
Yeah, as we said, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
As we said before, there was some mix of Greek and Egypt gods, right?
Yeah. So that came with the Greek contact with Egypt, and actually Eric Klein will probably talk a little bit about that, particularly in the Middle Kingdom or early New Kingdom. But there had been a long relationship between Greece and Egypt, and beginning with Herodotus, we have it in writing where he starts to equate Egyptian gods with Greek gods, and less direct than, say, the Roman, Zeus and Jupiter, which are really exactly the same. But for when Herodotus would look and understand what the gods' responsibilities were, he would, for instance, take the god Amen and equate that to Zeus. Or he would look at the god Anubis and equate that to Mercury. But then you'll see as the cultures blended more and more after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt or liberated it from Persia, that the gods had multiple affiliations as well. That might not just be one Greek god that they're associated with, that they would have multiple aspects to them. But you would also see something like the cult of Isis expand out throughout the Mediterranean and throughout the Roman world. That you have temples of Isis in England. Alyssa, did I see a raised hand? Yeah.
I just wanted to know what happened to Judaism, like if it played any role or something.
Well, yeah, the Jewish identity really took shape after the Exodus. And so, I mean, they had an identity in Egypt, but the role of monotheism, the Ten Commandments, of course, supposedly come during the Exodus. But once they settle into Canaan, then they become another political entity, another state there. The Jewish religion was fine, and the Romans, because the Romans were having a lot of hostile relationships with the Syrians, the Seleucid Empire, the ones who they chased out of Egypt before, when they chased Antiochus the Fourth, I think it was, out of Egypt, and told him to go home. The Seleucids controlled Palestine. And so when the Romans were involved in their political machinations as they moved into the Eastern Mediterranean, they made an alliance with the Jewish states at Judea. And so you've heard of Hanukkah, I assume, the holiday of Hanukkah? What is Hanukkah about?
It is like Christmas for Jewish people.
It's grown to be like Christmas because it happens at the same time of year, more or less. Though it's based on a lunar calendar, so it doesn't fall on the same day every year.
It is about candle.
About candles, right? So it's really about a military victory. So that the Seleucids, also Antiochus, but not the fourth, the later Antiochus, begins to oppress the Jews who are a client state under the Seleucid control at this point. And there's a rebellion by the Jews led by Judah Maccabee. And they defeat the Greek army, the Seleucid army from Syria, and they liberate their temple. And then there's a lamp, an eternal lamp that needs to burn in the temple all the time. So they relight the eternal lamp, but they only have enough oil for one day. And it'll take 7 days to get a new supply of oil logistically. So they light the oil, and by a miracle, it burns for 7 days until the new oil can come. And so the holiday is celebrated for 7 days. So unlike Christmas, this is about a military victory and a miracle associated with it. So they reestablished a Jewish kingdom there as an ally of Rome. And so you'll see as you go into Christianity, the period of Christianity, that the Jewish governors are clients of the Romans, right? They work for the Romans, basically, even though they still maintain Jewish lineage of royalty in Judea. But they are acting with the Romans at this point, also with the Ptolemies, and in the conflict with Seleucids. So there's a larger geopolitical situation to the Jews, and there was no problem with being Jewish in the Roman Empire. Like I said, the Romans were very open to it. So we mentioned that the cult of Isis and the god Osiris, her husband, spread throughout the Roman Empire. There were temples, major temples in Rome. The god Mithras from Persia became very popular with the Roman military and spread throughout the empire, mostly associated with the military establishment. So there's a temple to Mithras in London, for instance. If you ever go there, it's a very nice site to visit. They did a nice kind of virtual reconstruction underground where it is. So you see lots of gods are playing a role there, and there's not any particular one, aside from this growth of a cult of the emperor, which they kind of inherited from the idea of Alexander, because Alexander maintained a temple cult complex after his death, that after Augustus, that they develop a cult of the emperor, and that becomes the one ideology that's kind of attached on to other areas of religion to try to provide some sort of ideological foundation based on theology around the emperor. There is a nationalist ideology that begins to grow up with Rome as well, and that the being Roman is considered a privilege and a superior position, and so there's an ideology to become a Roman, and that's another aspect of ideology. So dealing with their clients, they didn't really, ideology wasn't a big part of it. But they did use economic force, political force, and military force with great effect. So the Dediticii, the people who are conquered by the Romans and brought into Roman rule. So they had three categories for looking at how to incorporate someone into the empire. These are formed around cities or civitas. And they had different statuses. So the highest level for one of these colonial cities, these foreign cities, is the civitas FOEDERATA, so allied states. So here's where you've entered into a special agreement with the emperor of Rome, and you are a close ally. Oftentimes that these civitas were actually made up of Roman colonial people who had come from Rome and settled into an area. And as you watch the expansion of the Roman Empire, it's often led by someone who goes to a foreign land in Gaul or Germany, or not as much in England, but eventually in England, establishes a colony there that's involved in trade. And so they're introducing the Roman Empire culturally and economically into a region. And that would then be followed by the military conquest and the larger incorporation, or more formal incorporation of the province into Rome. So the federated cities, these civitas FOEDERATA, these are the highest level of foreign settlement incorporated into the Roman Empire. That's the closest you could be to being Roman if you're from outside of Rome. The next level would be the civitas liberi, the free states. These were places that had a good relationship, like Judea would have had a relationship where they had a great deal of autonomy, even though there's still an aspect of Roman political and economic control and influence in the region. So here you can see some of the, when they conquered Macedonia, for instance, Philippi and Amphipolis became civitates liberi, free states within the Roman Empire, so that they maintained autonomy. They could mint their own coinage often. But they would contribute military troops. They were still subject to the Roman Empire, not as autonomous or high status as the federated cities, but the civitas liberate were still autonomous. They still had their own governor, were still ruling themselves.
Jay, maybe I missed this part, but what is the example of the first category, allied states?
Okay, some of these major places that I've put up on this map, I should have pointed that out. So Lugdunum, eventually Londinium, London, the colony that they established in Carthage, a lot of places where they're sending out their people. Once Egypt is fully incorporated after Augustus, Alexandria maintained a very special status, though, whereas every place else would still be sort of subject to the Roman Senate for administrative purposes. Alexandria was subject directly to the Caesar himself. So Egypt was a personal province that belonged to the Caesar. Other places belonged to Rome, and were part of the collective Roman wealth, but Egypt belonged directly to a special relationship to the emperor. So Alexandria, Kyrene down here would fall into it. At points, Judea.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. And also, I wanted to ask how it was decided to which groups the territory belongs.
Yeah, and that's for something like one of the federated cities, the Civitas Foederati, that often was people from Rome who went and settled to someplace. Later on in the empire, they would be retiring soldiers into these provinces and frontiers. So, well, when you get to the 3rd century AD, they open up who can actually be a Roman citizen. So they pass a new law that allows people to become Latini, to become Romans. And that then opens up the borders quite a bit and the concept of citizenship. And that helps them reorganize and re-strengthen their army, recruiting people who are actually Romans to fight within the army, because they're already bringing in so many foreigners into the army that it was decided that they're better to have them Romans than just foreigners, or have people have a path to earn citizenship to be Roman, to help encourage loyalty to Rome from these foreign armies that were filling in the ranks of the military. So in those cases, it was a direct relationship, often contractual, often a relationship directly to the Caesar, to the emperor. These other states are ones that had a good relationship politically with Rome, that were trusted, but not at the same level as the federated ones, who had a direct economic and political relationship, often a familial relationship even, to the central Roman province. And then the lowest level would be the civitatis stipendaria, right? So stipend. So people who were paying tribute to the empire. So here they might have their own governor, or they would have one that was appointed by a Roman and sent there, but they would be in a subservient position where they're forced to pay direct tribute, right? They're taxed as a conquered province. They might have native leadership, but they're under much more direct control of Rome as a tributary status. Let me see. Okay. Okay. This is actually a nice map too, because here we're at the 117 AD map, and it shows the ones that were controlled directly by the Senate, ones that were controlled by the empire itself, and they've included Egypt here as part of the imperial rule. So these are the areas, the farther out provinces that were conquered militarily, and so who controls the army controls these provinces. And then client states. And client states, and again, this is very dynamic. This is just a snapshot at 117. But as you watch the expansion of Rome, you'll see, particularly coming out in this area, for instance, in Cappadocia, Galatia, that oftentimes these states become a client first. So what is a client state? A client state is a state that retains its independence, but before the death of Cleopatra, Egypt was independent, but it was completely acting under the auspices, under the permission, sometimes with the financial support, sometimes giving financial support back to Rome, under Roman rule. Judea, when they rebelled against the Seleucids, that they were acting in concert with Roman desires, political desires for that region. So client state retains a certain level of independence, a full level of independence, yet it's understood that they're going to be acting on behalf of that other state. If you think of during the Soviet Union, Poland or East Germany, the members of the Warsaw Pact, were in essence client states of the Soviet Union, right? They were free independent states, but they weren't completely free and independent to do what they wanted, were they? And so that's that client state status. Oftentimes, what you'll see with the expansion of empires is that you'll end up in a client relationship with the empire as it's to your political advantage. Maybe it's out of fear, a combination of factors that you're going to work with this larger empire. But eventually, something might happen. There'll be some excuse for the empire to intervene directly. And so what you might see, what happened with the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia, right, or Hungary, where there's a rebellion within the state, the client state, that leads to direct military intervention by the empire to then solidify their control. When the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, for instance, what was the excuse for going into Afghanistan? If I recall my history correctly.
So there was an excuse in the case that in Afghanistan there was a communistic party that wanted to establish some new rules, and there was they have an argument with the local folk, because there was a contradiction between a new communistic rules and local traditions and rules, and there was an excuse for Soviet Union to integrate into Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that's often how it goes. If you look at the American intervention in Laos or Vietnam, for instance, the same thing is where you have factions within a country, and there's always factions, right? And one faction invites the empire to come and help them, and that then becomes the process of that country being actually incorporated into the empire. So it moves from a client state status to a tributary or a federated state within the empire. So in ancient empires, it's the same sort of thing, where you have one faction feuding with the rulers. They invite the Romans to come and help them. The Romans come, that new faction gets control, but then they're acting as a governor for the Romans, and they overcome their opposing faction. And so oftentimes you'll see this process happen as client states are swallowed up by the empire and become actually integrated fully into the empire. But they'll start out as in this in-between status where they're usually on the frontier of the empire, and they're having to choose sides, either this empire or if there's another empire on the other side, to choose one or the other. And then the factions within that state will often play a role in allowing one empire to fully intervene and take control. So a lot of these provinces you see, particularly over here in the East, originally started out as client states to Rome, and then were eventually incorporated into it. In Germany, it was more along the tribes, where some tribes, some of the Germanic tribes or Gallic tribes, might form alliances with the Romans, and then help them establish these new provinces. And same thing in Britain as well. So in maintaining an empire, one of the most important things, of course, is to maintain the communication networks. And so we talked about the importance of sea trade and the movement, the ability to move goods and people along the sea routes. But the Romans also became masters at engineering, and they engineered a road system that many of the roads still survive today, as well as other aspects of infrastructure, such as artificial harbors and aqueducts for transporting water, large water management systems. But this road network became essential because they had such vast areas of overland connection. To be able to make an empire work like that, you're going to have to establish these logistical controls, the mechanical means of communication, and then the organizational means, right? Having fortifications, relay stations along those roads, defending your frontiers, all these aspects of engineering and political and economic organization for moving resources in and out of the empire became essential to creating the network. And when you start to see the empire fall apart, oftentimes you start to see it fall apart on the fringes, right? Where the longer the communication route, the harder it is, the more cost, the more effort it takes to maintain those farther out areas centered on a very centralized authority of an empire. You could decentralize authority, which they would do, of course, a little bit with the governors, but when you're very much centralized, as the Romans were, that even the governors were forced to be on their own. And so when you watch, and we'll talk about it next week, when Roman Britain, we have a really nice example of that disassociation from the empire. At a certain point, the Romano-British are asking Rome for military assistance, and the emperor writes back to the governor in Britain and says, sorry, you're on your own. I can't help you anymore. So Britain, at that point, separates from the Roman Empire. Now, probably, the emperor hoped to be able to be in a position to put resources to reincorporate Britain back in later, but of course that never happened. So as we look at the power structure, the network structure, the communication structure for holding the empire together, you also see the weaknesses that allow the empire to start to fray and fall apart. This is kind of a nice example. And so this is a GIS system, so geographic information system, that looks at the transportation distances from various parts of the empire. So here, centered around Rome, where you have naval transport, you're looking at a contour line here that's within 7 days of transport. So this is 1 week that, within 1 week you can get anywhere here from Rome. Out here, we're looking at 2 weeks, and so on. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, so forth. There's a nice program online that allows us to look at that as well. Are you able to see the Orbis program?
No.
Let me change the share setting. So if you look at this program, what you're able to do is put in any two places in the Roman Empire. So let's see. If we're going from Egypt, like I talked about being in Aswan, so it's a little bit south of Coptos, to London, I was talking about the Hadrian's Wall. So if I were going, let's see, from London to Coptos, I can do a calculation using this GIS program. It'll show me the most efficient route. If you look at it here, if I do it just for the time of the year that you're doing it. So in July, it would take 55.1 days, covering 6,000 kilometers to go from northern England to southern Egypt. They calculate the price in denarii, and a denarii is a silver coin that was pretty much the pay of a soldier for 1 day. So this is the price in denarii based on use of sail ships, civilian riverboats, prices per kilo for moving wheat by donkey. in wagons, per passenger for carriage in a ship. And so it's a nice way to start to understand the logistical constraints and limitations and capabilities of living within the Roman Empire and moving about the empire. Okay, we're back to regular slides. So any questions so far?
Yeah, maybe just to clarify, we said that there are some client state. So to what categories they belong? We discussed free states, allied states, and so on.
Yeah, the client states are generally, and there could be a period of transition where they might be something like a tributary, but in general, the client states are independent of Rome. They maintain their own political identity still. Like we talked about with East Germany and Russia and the USSR, that East Germany was still its own state, but it was a client. It was acting on behalf and in conjunction with the Soviet Union, or Cuba as another example, or for a while I think Angola was in Africa. So a lot of these states became clients. They had a faction maybe put in power with the aid of the larger empire. South Vietnam, had a president who was put in power by the American government, supported by the American government, against the popular election that Ho Chi Minh was trying to have. So it's an independent state. So it isn't officially part of the empire, but it's acting as a client of the empire.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Okay. Alyssa, did you have a question too?
I wanted to know like some of the major sources or like motives of the Roman Empire to expand.
Yeah, originally it was almost a reaction to threats. The origin of the Roman Empire, like we talked about with Lucretia, was a reaction to an abuse of power and authority with her rape. The initial conquests of some of the neighboring tribes, again, were because of offenses like that, or because there was fear that they were going to be conquered by them, and so it was us or them, and the Romans won. Sometimes you'll see a pretense for these sort of things. Like if you look at America in 1898, right, and we enter into war with Spain, the Spanish-American War, and we used as a pretense the explosion of one of our battleships that was in harbor at Cuba, which was a Spanish colony, the battleship Maine. So it turns out that was an accident, that the boilers on the ship exploded. But there had been a faction in the United States, and it was driven by some of what was called the yellow journalist press. It was some of the newspapers who had ambitions to conquer a lot of Spanish territories in the Pacific and in Cuba and other places. So we created a pretense for going to war. And then we conquered a bunch of Spanish territory because the American Navy was much newer and more powerful than the Spanish Navy, which was way outdated. And so we conquered the Philippines, we conquered many islands in the Pacific, we conquered Cuba, Puerto Rico. So all these places became incorporated within the American Empire, and it was because we made a pretense for going to war. We had economic motives and political motives, and so the same thing would go on in ancient times as well, where there would be an offense, something, where Rome would take offense to something somebody did and create that as a pretext for war. Initially, it was mostly, out of fear or because there was some offense, but later they began to make excuses for going to war, particularly after the Punic Wars.
But was it then majorly about resources and getting more like agricultural land because they got like a lot of population? That's why they had to expand?
Later, that became more of an issue as they became more of a resource industrial complex where there was a big demand for food. So the population began to swell in Rome. It became an enormous city with over 1 million people. That they had to bring in food coming in all the time. They had a military that they had to arm, so they had to have iron and wood, resources like that coming in, as well as gold and silver to pay the military. So it became very resource intensive. But again, that built with time, mostly after the Punic Wars. One of the biggest motives for imperial expansion is fear. And it's fear of your competitors. So if you look at American expansion into Southeast Asia with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, what was going on? Why was that an important frontier to America? Why were we willing to invest so many lives and so much money to try to fight a war against the Vietnamese and Cambodians that,
Well, it was like against the Russian Federation. It was like just a war between the powers in another country.
Exactly. It was boundary maintenance. It was, America had developed a philosophy, where they thought if one country went communist, that there would be a domino effect and that other countries would follow suit. And so it became a matter of fear defending American boundaries in Southeast Asia. And so we became involved in an imperial war out of fear. There was also oil in Vietnam, so there was a resource factor as well. But the justification, at least, was fear. The justification that was given to the people. Why did we go into Iraq in 2003? What was the excuse for America going into Iraq?
As I remember, there was some deal with tyranny within the Iraq. So,
what was sold to the American people, and many of us knew it was a lie, is that what's that?
They went to the UN and said they have they're trying to get nuclear bombs.
Right. The term was weapons of mass destruction. That the Iraqis were developing lots of weapons of mass production. I remember looking at the satellite imagery that was shown by Colin Powell to the UN, and saying, no, that is not evidence for weapons of mass destruction. It's completely misrepresenting what this satellite imagery was. I did a lot of work with GIS and satellite imagery at the time. But to justify to the American people the invasion of Iraq, we had to present them as a threat. And then there was a false association with them with 9/11 as well, right? And when the Iraqis had nothing to do with 9/11, that it had closer ties to our ally, Saudi Arabia, and of course Afghanistan, than it did Iraq. But there was a sort of a association to revenge for 9/11. But the real reason sold to the American people to try to create popular support for the war was that they were representing a threat to us based on what happened with 9/11 because they had weapons of mass destruction. What was the real underlying economic motive? The oil, of course, right? To try and get more control and centralized control of oil in the Middle East. Excuse me one second, I'm just going to turn on light in here. Okay, so the same sorts of behaviors are going to go on in these ancient empires as well, where there's perception of threat. With the Punic War was very much a feeling of threat, more on the side of Carthage. I think Carthage felt more threatened that Italy was expanding into Sicily at this point, that the Romans were on, growing in strength, and that Carthage needed to put the Romans in check. So it became a target, which initiated the wars. But there's a mutual feeling of fear on both sides. So empires, ironically, become very fearful. people become very fearful, right? I mean, a lot of what motivates Americans on how they vote, is based on fear of what's going on in the rest of the world. And so it justifies, isolationism, hardening borders, perhaps military action and imperial action. So it's complex. One thing, and particularly as we talk about Luttwak's book here on the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, Luttwak tries to simplify imperial strategy, and people have taken his model, applied it to the Aztec Empire and other empires to explain how empires organize themselves and what are some of the major philosophies or strategic decisions that are made. And some of the criticisms are that it's an oversimplification, which I completely agree with. So what we're talking about, the motives for why an empire might expand into a particular territory they vary from territory to territory. Each relationship between the empire and one of these other states in the world, it has its own character and its own set of circumstances, its own set of economic resources and strategic interests and history, and even family relationships or business relationships. And so there's often not a grand strategy. It's often a very regional and circumstantial strategy. But I think it's important to think of this model because it does give us a way of looking at different parts of the empire and how in this case, the Romans were dealing with it. So the principes, let's see. Anna, do you want to read this? Anna Kleshnikov?
Yeah. The principes recognize that prudent diplomacy and discreet display of force were preferable to expensive and hazardous ventures.
Okay, so this brings up one of the ideas that Luttwak talks about, and that's the difference between what is power? We talk about social power in a military sense. If you have a big military, are you powerful? Yeah?
Probably yes, if it obeys you.
If what? If it obeys you, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so say you take that military and you get involved in, for the United States, a war in Southeast Asia and a war in the Middle East and a war in Africa and a war in Central America. So how powerful are you if your army is busy fighting everywhere? Does it reduce your power? There's the potential use of force, but if you're actually using the force, then you're expending it. You're using it up like money. I don't know if the analogy would work. If we went back to our dungeon and you decided to exert power on me as a group, you could say, share your chocolate bar with us, or we're going to take it from you by force. So as a group, you have a lot of power. Now, if we actually started fighting, and maybe I started winning, that power would dissipate very quickly. Or if you got tired, you would start to lose that power. If you think of power in a labor union, there's the potential power that you have of saying, we're going to go on a general strike and we're going to freeze your economy if you don't negotiate with us and give us the concessions we want for our workers. If you go on that strike and it is prolonged and now your workers don't have, aren't making enough money to eat, and you don't have the resources to keep giving them money or to keep giving them food and supporting them, you're dissipating that power that you had as a union before you went on the strike. So you can have power, but if you use it, you jeopardize losing it. It's finite. So if you think about the nature of the Roman Empire here, the prudent use of diplomacy and the discreet display of force is preferable to the expensive and hazardous ventures, right? If you commit that legion to war in Germany, and you're expending all the money to send the army to war, and as happened, on at least one disastrous occasion, right, where the Roman legions that invaded Germany were completely wiped out to the man, very few survivors. You've expended all of that power through unnecessary display of force, and you've completely weakened your empire. So what Lutwak is saying is that the Romans were very cognizant of this, that if you committed your military to go fight a war, you were expending that power, and that there's a good chance that you are weakening yourself and you don't have those forces to go elsewhere, and that you may end up losing them, and it's going to be costly financially and militarily if you're not victorious. And even if you are victorious, it still may be costly. You've heard of a Pyrrhic victory from Pyrrhus of Epirus. There on the Illyrian coast, he was considered by Hannibal, I think, as probably one of the greatest generals of the ancient world. Well, the term Pyrrhic victory came after he invaded Italy and tried to conquer the Romans in the it's the 2nd century BC, might have been the late 3rd century. But he tried to conquer the Romans, and he won all of his battles against the Romans, but he lost so many men doing it that he supposedly said, one more victory like this and I'll be defeated. I will have won myself to losing. That he couldn't afford to keep losing that many people to win battles. And so we have the term Pyrrhic victory, which is, I won, but the cost was so high that it wasn't worth going to war and winning. So you expend your power when you engage in, as they say here, expensive and hazardous ventures. Let's see, who do I have over here? Tatiana, do you want to read this one?
Yeah. Power born of potential force is not expanded when it is used, nor is it a infinite quality. Force, on the other hand, is just that. If directed to one purpose, it cannot simultaneously be directed at another, and if used, it is ipso facto consumed. What is ipso facto?
Is in fact consumed. So in reality, it's gone. So this is this concept that if you're trying to maintain an empire, if you're always attacking and you're always being belligerent and being really forceful, using your military everywhere, you're going to erode your power to the point where eventually you don't have enough power to maintain your empire. The president of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, right at the turn of the century, famous for building a giant fleet and sailing it around the world to express American military power in the early 1900s. He had a saying that was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Right, and the idea was, don't be a dick, right? As an empire, as a nation, talk respectfully to people, have a lot of power, but you don't want to use that power. You want to instead be more diplomatic and let people know that you have the power without expending the power. And so it's kind of the the current president of the United States likes to talk very belligerently and aggressively and threaten force all the time. And then he tried using a little bit of it. We killed the one general in Iraq, one of the Iranian generals. The Iranians struck back at one of our military bases, launched a barrage of missiles, injured about 30 American soldiers. And the president was forced to go, well, actually, none of our soldiers were injured. They were, in fact, injured. And then stop, because he had put himself in a position where he couldn't go into the retaliation. So they were allowed to retaliate against the American military base without any consequences. So it's this balance that a politician has to make between negotiation and actual use of force, particularly when you're the big imperial power and you're looking at the maintenance of military frontiers all around the world. So Ludwig divided empires, the Roman Empire, into two phases, two strategic time periods. So the first is this hegemonic empire. And what you see is that he broke it into zones of integration into the empire. So he had this outer zone of influence, an inner zone of diplomatic control, and here's where you see your client states involved. And then you had your imperial forces with much more direct control on the interior parts of the empire, right? So originally just in Italy itself after they conquered the Etruscans. And so out in the outer zones of influence, he says client tribes. What do you think he means by client tribes? If you imagine the Roman Empire expanding, so it's running into all these people. Some might be organized, particularly where there's a long history of states and complex societies in the Middle East and Anatolia and Greece, where you have city-states. That those become client states, and it's a little bit easier to negotiate with them, right? Because they have a central place, they have a hierarchy, a complex socio-political system, a government that you can deal with. One thing with empires is that they tend to prefer to deal with one person if they can. So you see, like when the United States was working on expanding its influence into Central America, a lot of times we would support a dictator. It was a strategy we used actually around the world, was to support a dictator, because then you just had to deal with that dictator. And if that dictator then ruled the country, you had control of the country. If you wanted to put a military base in the country, that dictator, all you had to do is bribe him or use your influence on him, and he would allow you to have a military base. So strategically, one of the biggest, I think, flaws in American foreign policy in post-World War II was this trying to put one person in control of these client countries, and then that way they could have that one-to-one negotiation and have influence just dealing with one person, rather than trying to deal with some sort of elected body, which is obviously much more difficult to deal with. So in this inner diplomatic control zone, you could deal with these client states because they were more centralized in authority. Outside in Germania and Gaul, where the political centralization was more at a chiefdom level rather than state level, more ranked societies, that they were more mobile. They could abandon their territory and move to another territory. That it was more based on clan relationships and more diffuse, so you'd have to deal with multiple chiefdoms for dealing with the people living in a particular territory. So a lot of times the Romans would be involved in cultural exchanges, economic exchanges, military exchanges, to create relationships, paying tribute, where the Romans would bribe these tribes to be friendly, and so maintain these outer zones of control. And then, so what they're doing is they've got a series of political controls where they don't have direct Roman political control. It doesn't take a Roman legion. It doesn't take, a governor going there. It doesn't take even a sophisticated roadway. It could be a handful of Romans who go to pay a bribe every year to a series of the chiefs. And then those chiefs agree not to raid into the Roman territory, maybe to defend the Roman territory, to establish maybe a civitas where the Romans could then set up a trade and market network to exchange with them. They began to take some of these chiefs and their families back to Rome to educate them in the Roman ways. So it's a way of maintaining political control that requires a low investment of force. They're not having to put a lot of diplomatic or economic energy into maintaining those boundaries. But as Rome continued to expand, it continued to incorporate more and more territories, Ludwig sees them moving towards what he calls a territorial empire. Now you're having to fortify your empire. You're having to make these hard boundaries. So you fortify the limes, the series of chain of fortifications along the Rhine River to defend against the Germans. You build Hadrian's Wall in northern England to put a boundary between you and the Celtic barbarians to the north. A series of fortifications across the Middle East and Egypt, across the desert frontiers. So they begin to harden their boundaries, and they try to maintain these very hard fortified lines, which take a high investment of military power, recruiting soldiers both locally, but also bringing soldiers from Rome or from other places in the empire to fortify and occupy these. They develop policies of letting soldiers retire after 20 or 30 years of service and giving them a piece of land on that frontier. So you begin to build this ready reserve of Romans who are living on the frontier and maintaining that land and that boundary for you. So it was a different strategy to the hegemonic strategy, which didn't require that big investment in hard fortified lines. So this territorial expanse, oh my gosh, I just get going. We're out of time. So we'll end with the concept of the territorial empire, and we'll talk about some of the criticisms of it next week, and then we'll start to get into the concept of collapse of societies after that. Any last questions? Did I hear a hand go up? I think we're good. Okay. I'll stay on for a few minutes if anyone has any questions, anything they want to ask. But we'll call the night here and end with Ludwig's model of territorial empire. All right. Good night. Do svidania. Spokojnej noche.
You too. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye. Good night. Bye-bye.